Duke Ellington is without question one of America's great composers. He was also a leader and innovator in jazz throughout his life. Though he and his music are celebrated, his life and music are not free from controversy. Ellington's sacred concerts illustrated this very well. Despite being well attended at the time and revered by many, there were similarly many detractors and critics of what Ellington frequently said was his most important work. These criticisms have come from both the musical and liturgical world, which is to be expected when creating a piece of art that shifts accepted paradigms from all sides. In the face of these criticisms, Ellington continued to write, perform, and work on music for his sacred concerts up until his death. The importance of this musical work is illustrated in the opening of his memoir of life with his father, where Mercer Ellington tells the story of his father giving him instructions on how the premiere recording of the third sacred concert from Westminster Abbey is to be edited while receiving chemotherapy for the cancer that would take his life soon thereafter. Though it is impossible to ever really know what is or was going on in someone else's heart and mind, this paper will explore why this music and work was so important to Duke Ellington. Edward Kennedy Ellington was born in 1899 to Daisy Kennedy Ellington and James Edward Ellington and was raised in Washington, D.C. Life in Washington, D.C. offered many advantages that were not available to African Americans in the early 20th century. There was a flourishing community, despite segregation, that offered many opportunities that would not have been available to a young Duke Ellington in other circumstances. Here, Ellington's parents could raise he and his siblings in an environment of opportunity that wasn't available in most other parts of the country. Even before the Civil War, Washington, D.C. attracted free African Americans from all over the nation, and by the turn of the 20th century, it was one of the few places in the U.S. where black families could enjoy a comfortable middle-class lifestyle, and their children could receive a good educational foundation. Duke Ellington also enjoyed the advantage of having very accomplished parents. Daisy had the distinction of being a high school graduate, which was unusual at the time for a woman of her station, and James worked for Dr. Middleton Cuthbert, who allowed James to educate himself by reading the contents of his library. James would eventually become very trusted in Dr. Cuthbert's home, and eventually went on to make blueprints for the U.S. Navy. With their social and educational founding in the setting of early 20th century D.C., both of Ellington's parents were able to impart the view that no person was lesser. Daisy raised Duke to believe that all people have worth, regardless of their race or heritage, because God made them. Religious beliefs aside, this is additionally unsurprising considering that Duke's sister Ruth was known to claim that the Ellington family heritage included people from Africa, England, Ireland, and India. The black church was extremely influential in the Washington, D.C. of Ellington's youth. It was also extremely influential in the Ellington home. Daisy took her children to both the 19th Street Baptist Church and the John Wesley AME Zion Church every week, which gave a young Duke a strong foundation of both of his parents' familial religious traditions and offered a sense of security. Because of this, Duke Ellington repeatedly heard stories of the weak overcoming the strong, the childless becoming fertile, and slaves becoming great leaders, a powerful message for a young black boy growing up under segregation. This background, coupled with his mother's insistence that he was blessed, led Duke Ellington to believe that anything was indeed possible. Another occurrence that buttressed the faith of his youth was his early brush with death due to pneumonia. This happened before penicillin had been discovered, so a diagnosis of pneumonia was truly life-threatening. Daisy Ellington stayed with her young son throughout the hardest parts of his illness, and later Duke Ellington would say that his mother's prayers were what allowed him to survive. The combination of his parents' love, open-mindedness, education, and spirituality were key to young Edward's transformation to Duke, an early nickname that would become his larger-than-life persona. Because of James's position with Dr. Cuthbert, Duke Ellington had access to many of the finer things in life at an early age. James Ellington insisted that the family dinner table be set formally and that their dress should match. Ruth Ellington said her father was a Chesterfieldian gentleman, very charming. James Ellington also had a great knowledge of fine food, wine, and was a skilled ballroom dancer. Duke Ellington also said that he wished he shared his father's artful way with words. James's glib tongue seemed to always find the right thing to say regardless of situation. He had a sharp wit, and always had an artful way of finding the perfect thing to say to a lady. His father also made it very clear that it was of the utmost importance to have exceptionally good manners and speech as an African American. His mother ran the home as one with Victorian sensibilities. All of these things would become a part of the public persona that Duke Ellington radiated through his life. Though his family did their best to live a high society lifestyle in Duke Ellington's childhood, the family would not enjoy the trappings of real wealth until the later success of the Duke Ellington Orchestra. He was always impeccably dressed and presented himself with an air of humble sophistication. He was so committed to living this way that he occasionally spent all of his money to do so. However, this lifestyle did not come from being stingy with money elsewhere. Ellington was extremely generous and forgiving, and it was known that he did not seek reprisal when wronged. He was also known to be a generous tipper and freely gave money to panhandlers and the less fortunate. Ellington was also vice president of the board of the Odyssey House Rehabilitation Program and did benefit performances with his orchestra to support their programs. Duke Ellington also took extremely good care of his musicians and was extremely forgiving when they transgressed. Instead of punishing them or berating them as other band leaders have done famously, Ellington would put them in mildly embarrassing situations on the bandstand to bring them back into line. It was not uncommon for him to simply forgive dishonesty because he preferred not to invite conflict. When musicians left his orchestra for another band, he did not bear a grudge. Often the musicians were welcomed back later if the situation they left for proved to be less than favorable. He cared enough about his sidemen that he would keep them on the payroll if something occurred that was beyond their control that prevented them from performing. It has already been established that Duke Ellington's parents raised him to believe that all people had value regardless of their race because God made them. This is something that he carried with him through his life. It is easy to see how this figured into his life regarding race and race relations, but it is especially evident in his work and closeness with Billy Strayhorn. In 1939, Ellington hired Billy Strayhorn to come on the band as an arranger. It did not matter that Strayhorn was homosexual. Ellington saw his talent and promise and welcomed him into the fold immediately. This is significant because Duke Ellington's inner circle of family and close friends was very insular and difficult to penetrate. Strayhorn would spend the first year of his time with the Duke Ellington Orchestra living in Duke's New York penthouse with Ellington's lover, his sister Ruth, and his son Mercer, while he studied scores of the band's book. By the end of this year, he would be contributing his own works, and Strayhorn tunes like Chelsea Bridge and the band's eventual theme song Take the A-Train would become classics in their own right. They were never in competition with one another, and Duke Ellington would publicly shower Sweet Pea with praise from both the bandstand and in the media. Ellington's collaboration with Strayhorn was one of the most productive and long-standing in the history of jazz. The two were incredibly close, with Ellington saying he was indebted to Strayhorn more than anyone. The two composers worked together until Strayhorn passed in 1967. Despite his religious upbringing and home life that focused on the best of all things, Duke Ellington had many human failings that led many to question whether his work surrounding the sacred concerts was genuine or not. The lifestyle of a touring jazz musician was not conducive to regular church attendance or a standard home and family life. Ellington managed to avoid the use of heavy drugs that were pervasive among musicians and stopped drinking heavily early in his life. His most known and public failing was his love of women. Duke Ellington married Edna Thompson, whom he met while still in high school in 1918 because they were expecting the birth of their son Mercer. The two separated in 1928, but were not divorced, and not long thereafter Duke Ellington was in a relationship with Mildred Dixon, a singer. About a decade later, Ellington began another relationship with Evie Ellis, who was a dancer at the Cotton Club. This was a short-lived affair, as Duke Ellington would not divorce Edna. This may offer some more insight into his spiritual beliefs because despite his philandering, he still cared for his wife in all other ways. They remained friendly, raised Mercer together, and Duke Ellington supported her financially until she passed. As an adult, Mercer stated that he believed his father's strong feelings about his faith and spirituality in the face of his infidelity. He said that his father was well aware of his impure actions and his unwillingness to cease that behavior, and added that his father refused to be held up as a moral example for others to follow. In response to these criticisms, Duke Ellington's sister Ruth also asserted that her brother's faith was absolutely genuine. She saw and heard their Christian upbringing throughout his music. It was her opinion that the spiritual basis for all his music was what made it special, and so much different from everyone else's music. This extended in Ruth's mind even to his earliest work. She said of his earlier work, "The jungle music was not simply that. It expressed the frustration of blacks, male-female relationships, our basic humanity. When Edward was writing music, he was expressing love and the emotionality of human experience." There were many people who thought, however, that Duke Ellington's focus on the continued writing for and performances of the sacred concerts at the closing years of his life came from a fear of his own impending death following the passing of his wife and that of longtime collaborator and friend Billy Strayhorn. Still others suggested that it represented an attempt at atonement for a lifetime of infidelity. Ellington biographer Barry Ulanov noted that even Ellington himself questioned whether he was worthy to make such a statement with his sacred concerts, in the eyes of the public and especially in the eyes of God. Ellington dealt with this in many ways. One way was that he referred to himself as God's messenger boy, inferring that the music was not necessarily from him, but from above. This idea fits well with the common biblical theme of God doing his holy works through imperfect people and raising the lowly to positions of power and prestige. Duke Ellington's faith was quietly a constant thread throughout his life. He always wore a gold cross that was a gift from his sister Ruth, and he was found frequently with his Bible when outsiders wandered into his not often seen private life. Don George gave a very powerful account of this. He said that when he happened into a small private space and found Ellington alone and deeply in prayer one night, that he was so moved that he immediately fell to his own knees in prayer for the first time in his life. In what is probably the most telling and honest statement about the nature of the music of the sacred concerts, Duke Ellington said, with regard to the invitation to perform the first sacred concert at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco, "Now I can say openly what I have been saying to myself on my knees." Duke Ellington wrote music for 3 distinct sacred concerts that were performed all over the world on more than 100 occasions. This, combined with Ellington's propensity to rework his compositions and occasionally add things to specific performances of the sacred concerts, makes a full analysis of the music of the sacred concerts well beyond the scope of a paper of this length. To better focus my research, I conducted a small-scale survey. To do this, I created a simple 4-question survey with a Google Sheet. I sent the link to 80 other musicians from within my network of friends on Facebook with a request for them to take the survey, and the assurance that their email addresses were not being collected and their responses would be anonymized. The 80 musicians were a mixture of jazz musicians, scholars, military musicians, and church musicians. I got a roughly 30% response rate to the survey. The first 2 questions were multiple choice, and the last 2 required short answers. I've chosen what I feel are the best of the short answers to present. The multiple choice questions existed to determine familiarity with the sacred concerts, and the responses can be seen here. The first of the 2 short answer questions asks, is there a specific section of one of the sacred concerts that you find to be particularly interesting compositionally, and why? Here are some of my favorite responses. Ellington's writing of rhythmically sparse but harmonically dense backgrounds is one of the things that stands out to me in his compositions, and this is especially true in the sacred concerts pieces. Come Sunday is a fine example of this. The initial chords of Come Sunday set an expectant tone for the singer's request, while the verses, and especially the bridge, stride confidently through the building of that plea. The final question of the survey asks, is there a specific section of one of the sacred concerts that you find to be particularly interesting spiritually or emotionally, and why? My favorite response follows. In my perspective, Come Sunday takes me on a soul-searching journey of how I feel when I see and experience church. When I keep listening to the piece, I get more and more interested and want more. I feel like I'm there in the church, listening and experiencing something bigger than me. I'm committed and can't just turn it off. I am compelled to want more. This is my favorite piece in perspective that heals the soul. With the survey's short answer responses coming in so heavily tilted towards Come Sunday, I decided to limit my analysis of the music to the first sacred concert. I will also examine In the Beginning God and David Danced Before the Lord with All His Might. The first sacred concert premiered on September 16, 1965 at Grace Cathedral in San Francisco in response to an invitation by Dean Bartlett and Reverend John S. Yarian. The Duke Ellington Orchestra was joined by Esther Merrill, Bunny Briggs, John Hendricks, Brock Peters, the Grace Cathedral Choir, directed by Richard Purvis, the Herman McCoy Choir, directed by Herman McCoy, and the Cathedral Organist. The first sacred concert opens with the expansive In the Beginning God. It is the longest of the pieces in the first sacred concert, occupying a nearly 16-minute runtime. The piece has 4 major sections, an introduction, A, B, and C, and it is through composed. The introduction features a piano solo with bass and drums, and is followed by a baritone saxophone solo with piano and later orchestral accompaniment. The introduction finishes with a clarinet solo accompanied by the orchestra that is bookended with short cadenzas. Every part of the introduction serves to introduce and emphasize the 6-note motif that will be sung for the first time at the opening of the A section. The vocal is accompanied by a relatively sparse orchestral accompaniment and is followed by a double-time presentation of the prior material. There is a brief spoken word interlude accompanied by the rhythm section. The A section closes with the remaining melody presented at the slow tempo like a recitative, with a closing orchestral flourish. The B section opens with a tenor saxophone solo. This solo will go on to serve as a substantial part of the orchestra's accompaniment of the choir's recitation of the Old Testament books of the Bible. Following the recitation, the tenor saxophone plays a brief unaccompanied solo that leads into an orchestral fanfare. The fanfare introduces a trumpet solo that is based on the original 6-note in the beginning theme and features Cat Anderson, the band's lead trumpet player, reaching for the heavens, or at least the highest note he can play. The trumpet solo ends with Duke Ellington eventually declaring, "That's as high as we go," before beginning to play himself to introduce the recitation of the New Testament books of the Bible. This recitation closes the B section. The C section is a brief coda. It opens with a substantial drum solo. It is followed by a final choral presentation of the main theme and an orchestral flourish where Cat Anderson once again shows off his command of the extreme upper register of the trumpet. Duke Ellington tried to involve the ailing Billy Strayhorn in the creation of this work despite his declining health due to cancer. He asked Strayhorn for his own In the Beginning theme. Strayhorn's theme, though not used, started and ended on the same notes that Ellington had chosen, and only slightly differed by 2 notes. This is another illustration of how close the two were compositionally. All the texts for this section were written by Ellington himself, and there were many criticisms of his lyrics for this section in particular. This was mostly in response to the simple recitation of the books of the Bible, which many people still view as a pedestrian Sunday school exercise. This, coupled with the spoken word section declaring modern things that would not exist but for God creating them, could just as easily be viewed as Ellington declaring the expansive and pervasiveness of God's message in creation. It would not be a bridge too far to suggest that listeners may form their own opinions of the text based on their preconceived notions of Christianity or their personal beliefs. It is also unsurprising that Duke Ellington chose to feature both substantial trumpet and drum solos in the later parts of this first section, as the trumpet, cymbals, and the frame drum are the only modern instruments that were used by the Duke Ellington Orchestra that were also expressly mentioned in the Bible. Come Sunday has its origins in the earlier Ellington composition, Black, Brown, and Beige, which premiered at Carnegie Hall on January 23, 1943. Though it received an elated response from the sold-out crowd that braved a snowstorm to attend the premiere, the critics were not as kind. The jazz critics thought it was too pompous and divorced from the dance music influences in jazz at the time, and the classical critics thought it was too heavily influenced by dance music and not arcane enough for the concert hall. Race may have played some part in the negative critical reception as well. Following the rousing reception of the audience, Ellington was devastated by the critics in the next day's press. The full original title of the work is Black, Brown, and Beige, a tone parallel to the history of the Negro in America. Ellington intended it to be a symphony that told the full story of Black Americans, from their forced removal from Africa to their modern contributions to World War II, with a sharp focus on bringing Black virtue, dignity, and contributions to modern society to the forefront of the American conversation with his music. In its original form, Come Sunday was a purely instrumental work. Ellington's papers at the Smithsonian suggest that Come Sunday was a highly programmatic work, with a deeply spiritual message. It centers around a young slave named Beulah, who is brought to America. Beulah teaches himself to read the Bible and finds a message of hope for his future freedom and justice from a compassionate God that will end his suffering. The importance of this message and the poor critical reception was likely a strong influence in Ellington's repeated returns to this music. The first major return of Come Sunday was marked by the abridged recording of Black, Brown, and Beige that was released in 1958 and featured gospel singer Mahalia Jackson. Unlike the original version of the song, which featured Johnny Hodges playing the central melody on the alto saxophone, this recording featured lyrics to Come Sunday for the first time, as well as a new instrumental arrangement that was contributed by Billy Strayhorn. Columnist Ralph Gleason wrote that this was a performance of such force that he had a difficulty listening to it dry-eyed. Ray Nance also said that he was moved to tears upon hearing this new arrangement for the first time in rehearsal. The vocal version of Come Sunday that was presented for the first sacred concert had its origins in what was presented on the Mahalia Jackson recording, but it had its own distinct character that represented a further evolution in what Duke Ellington was trying to say with this music. The song is in 32-bar AABA form, and the vocal is more condensed than what was recorded prior, but Ellington's sparse arrangement makes it extremely impactful, and it couples with and enhances the subsequent number, the Lord's Prayer, very well. The full form of the vocal in the first sacred concert is a mere 52 bars. There is a 2-bar solo piano introduction, and then the vocalist sings the full form of the song once through. She repeats the last 16 bars of the form once more with the orchestra, and it closes with a final 2 bars played by the reeds and trombones. Ellington scored this even more simply than Strayhorn to put even more emphasis and focus on the vocal and the lyric. It is scored for only 10 musicians, and the only use of the rhythm section is the 2-bar introduction on the piano. The remaining 9 musicians are 2 clarinets, tenor saxophone, bass clarinet, 2 trumpets playing with hat mutes, and 3 trombones playing with closed plunger mutes. Ellington put further emphasis on the vocalist by nearly eliminating all sense of time by cutting out the rhythm section and having the horns focus on long sustained chords that were further limited by motion no faster than that of a quarter note. This gave the vocal an ethereal and otherworldly quality in the cathedral acoustic and made the performance feel more like a soulful, heartfelt recitative that pointed towards a longing for a better world. Come Sunday is reprised following the Lord's Prayer. This is the same version from the Carnegie Hall premiere of Black, Brown, and Beige that was made famous by Johnny Hodges. There are some who suggest that this was done by Ellington to fill time after devoting most of his effort to In the Beginning God. An alternative, preferable explanation is that Ellington wished to use Come Sunday as a sort of musical connective tissue to create a longer continuity of form throughout the work. The impact of Come Sunday that was found by the survey conducted for this paper should be noted here as well in support of this second assertion. This instrumental iteration of Come Sunday is in 8 sections, and Johnny Hodges is the only person to play the full 32-bar form. The song opens with an 8-bar introduction of the melody played by trombone with woodwind and rhythm section. This was followed by a modulatory reed solo with rhythm section that led directly into a clarinet solo, accompanied by the remaining woodwinds. The next section introduces counter melodies to the clarinet solo, accompanied by the rhythm and woodwinds. They are soon joined by a plunger-muted trumpet solo, which led into another modulatory section that features a piano solo by Ellington. This leads directly into Johnny Hodges' famous interpretation of the melody. The accompaniment for this section is similarly sparse as the vocal solo, and it has the same focusing effect on Hodges' playing. The song closes with a short coda for bass and woodwind trio. David danced before the Lord with all his might was one of the more controversial parts of the performance as far as the liturgical critics were concerned. Duke Ellington's time in the Cotton Club featured all sorts of dancing, and there were many who thought that the tap dancing didn't belong in the church. One of those was John Hendricks, whom Ellington included in part because of his religious convictions. When John pressed Ellington on whether scat singing and tap dancing had any place in the sanctuary, Ellington produced a well-handled Bible and pointed out the section of 2 Samuel that he used to derive his text. Additionally, the inclusion of tap and scat singing fit with Ellington's view that God accepts any offering made to him that was presented out of love. Bunny Briggs was the dance soloist for the first sacred concert. The accompaniment used for David Danced is based on the original Come Sunday theme. The melodic material is moved from a slow 4 into a quick double time to better accommodate the tap dancer, who is the central figure of this closing section. As such, the orchestra's playing is very restrained and subservient to the tap dancer. David Danced also uses the same 32-bar AABA form as Come Sunday, and the form is repeated completely 5 times with a truncated 6th chorus. The only fully improvised part of this final section is that of the dancer, and the dancer performs throughout. The song opens with an unaccompanied dance solo that leads into the first full chorus. The first chorus features the dance soloist accompanied by the rhythm section and reeds, and the choir sings the text very pointedly from the second A section to the end of the form. In the second chorus, the choir begins by singing the melody on the syllable lu, with some additional trombones and sparing improvised interjections from the solo trumpet. The third chorus is much like the first, with the choir singing for the duration of the form and continued trumpet solo and thicker scoring of the background figures. In the fourth chorus, the background focus shifts to improvised solo piano with solo fills in the clarinet as the dance and solo continues to bring the intensity back down a bit. The fifth chorus returns to choir lus with rhythm section accompaniment that builds into a truncated 6th chorus. The first A section of the sixth chorus features a shout chorus with clarinet solo over the dance solo, and the second A section adds a drum solo and the choir singing again. After this half chorus, there is another fully unaccompanied dance solo, and the song ultimately closes with tutti chords in the orchestra to bring the work to a rousing close. Through this brief examination of Duke Ellington's life, music, and spirituality, there are a few threads that run through continually. One is the willingness to work and rework his music until it sends the message he intends. Another is his open, welcome demeanor and belief in equality. The last is his continual awareness of and guidance by faith. Though it was not always visible on the surface, Duke Ellington was a man whose imperfect lifestyle and art were nevertheless guided by a very strong faith. He felt strongly enough about this to devote the last 10 years of his life to writing an incorporation of the sacred concerts into his regular touring and performance schedule. His insistence on this work made great changes in liturgical music as well, because it introduced the idea of jazz as a legitimate form of worship that should be welcomed into the Christian sanctuary, eventually opening the doors for other forms of music in worship. This was further emphasized by Dean Bartlett in his preface to the San Francisco concert, where he wrote, "Is liturgical worship the only form of public prayer? We believe not. Among other forms, surely, must be included all expressions of the creative and performing arts, especially where such expressions are offered consciously by the artists and performers to the service of God."